Okay, gonna go ahead and start recording now. But yeah, Zach, that's a conversation you and I can have for hours talking about that kind of stuff. But I've been a folklorist for several years, and as a pluralist chaplain, I've dealt with all sorts of different worldviews and traditions. Which I think when you study stuff like that, even if it doesn't directly inform your art, um, it can't help but make your work better because when you stuff into your brain all sorts of different worldviews, that helps your brain find connections. It helps your brain make connections, and it just adds a layer of depth to whatever you produce. I think personally, even if it's not there directly, like I said, it's there still enough to really give a level of energy and vocabulary to your work that you probably might not even be consciously aware of. So stuff like that I think is awesome. Well, I will. Both of you guys are here. That's good to see. I'm sorry, Zach, you got a cold. Was it because you were doing stuff with extended family over fall break?
Oh no, I mostly just worked.
Oh, okay. All right. Getting a cold when you're tired sucks. One of the things that I found that actually helps me is a little. If you go and get some of that apple cider vinegar, organic apple cider vinegar with the mother, and just put like a tablespoon of that in a glass of something else, not milk, because it curdles the milk and it's disgusting. But if you're not allergic to the vinegar and if you can stand it, that is enough to boost. A lot of the times, it's enough to make it so that I don't get colds very often. And I don't know if that's because it boosts my immune system or if my body is thinking, oh, that tastes so horrible. We better not get sick because he'll drink more of it. Either way, I come out on top. But that's some grandparents' folk wisdom. Don't take it too seriously unless you do your own studies first. Well, the screen is dark. I want to share my screen here. So that, oh man, I just hit something weird. I'm sorry about this. Everything I touch is the wrong thing today. Okay, here we go. So for everybody watching the recording is going to be black screen for a couple minutes, and then now we're going to screen share. Um, Zach and Lindsay, can you see this? Should say Dark Ages and Charlemagne.
Yes.
All
Yeah.
right. All right. Because we were talking about right before we started recording for everybody at home, we were talking about folklore traditions and some really ancient folklore traditions. Um, and I think it kind of ties into this. The Dark Ages, I want to share this with you because I just think it's pretty amazing. These are some of the oldest stained glass windows in um, Europe. These are really, really old things. It's Augsburg Cathedral. And hopefully, can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Scottish Stained Glass is a stained glass company that they have some really fun stuff on their website. But these windows were made in they think about 1065. So these are stained glass windows, but they're about 300 or 400 years earlier than the ones that you're used to seeing from old cathedrals in Europe. And you can tell big eyes on the people. They're very stiff, and the clothing is more there's not much shading. I mean, like you look on this, the robes, you can tell there's wrinkles there because they painted the wrinkles on. There's no shading or anything. And then there's this old English lettering right around here. And I like stuff like this because you can tell it's been around, it's really old. And this is pretty much, I think, a pretty good perspective on the kind of stuff we see for the most part. Now, I say Dark Ages, and I have that in big, fat, foam finger air quotes, and Charlemagne. The Dark Ages is considered to be a time period between the fall of Rome, which is 5th century AD, and the beginning of the Renaissance, which was almost 1,000 years later. The, the reason it's called the Dark Ages, it's not because people were dumb. It's not because nobody did anything. It's not because there's nothing going on. The reason it's called the Dark Ages is because it did not fit into a comfortable narrative for people that were putting together art history during the Enlightenment. They wanted to be connected. The people that, the philosophers and thinkers of the Enlightenment era, and we're talking about 1650 to about 1800, 1790, right around there. The people that were living in this time period, that were the thinkers, the shakers, the publicists, the publicizers, they wanted everybody to really connect with the Renaissance because that's when everything suddenly became beautiful, they thought. And so everything before the Renaissance, after the fall of Rome, became the Dark Ages because it was important for the Enlightenment to turn the minds of people back to the enlightened thinking of Roman philosophers and Greek philosophers. We're talking about Socrates and Plato for Greek philosophers, and of course, Aristotle. Aristotle is a big forward thinker. He defined how we view a lot of our approach to scientific thinking. But then also we have Flavius Josephus and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a big Roman philosopher. He was the guy that he wrote a book all about ethics and morality that really defined how a lot of these thinkers thought. And then Flavius Josephus was a Roman historian that really helped shape how people thought about creating history. And so for the Enlightenment thinkers, these are the guys that set the stage for the American Revolution. The idea that people should make a constitution for their country, their approach to governance as an enlightened republic, those kinds of thinkers. They really wanted to associate themselves with these Greek and Roman thinkers. So everything between the fall of Rome, 476, and the Renaissance was considered dark ages by them. And we'll see that it wasn't really dark. It didn't have an awful lot to do with darkness. In fact, what was kind of funny to me is, believe it or not, about 4 times as many people could read or write during the so-called Dark Ages as they could during the Renaissance. Dark Ages, we get about a 20% literacy, and during the Renaissance, we get about a 5 to 10% literacy rate. So I just think that that's really interesting. And even this isn't really entirely appropriate um, and of course, this is all kind of set up. When Enlightenment thinkers were looking at this, looking at the fall of Rome, 200 years before this, 250 years, Constantine moved the seat of his Roman empire to Turkey. That's why the capital of Turkey was called Constantinople for over 1,000 years. He built the largest building with an unsupported dome, or with no center supports to the dome, in the history of the world in the 3rd century. So, 200 years before this. It got burned down a while later and then was rebuilt a little bit later. But his Rome lasted from the mid 3rd century all the way to right before the start of the Renaissance. So, this is the fall of Rome when its seat was in Rome, Italy. And that's what it refers to. So even then, things are kind of a little bit odd. But the whole setup for that is, I want to really make sure that you understand that terms like Dark Ages and this kind of dismissive view for those people that lived at that time, that was developed for us by people that were publicists during the Enlightenment era, which is about 1650 to 1800. That's about the time period we're talking about. And I'm not going to blame them. That's not because they were dumb or anything like that. They wanted people to take their new era of thinking very seriously. And I'm glad that they did, because of them, we get people like the thinkers that established constitutional governments from the end of the 1700s on through to 1900. The people that developed a rationale to really help us think that um, voting rights were something that we could have as a right, and we did have the possibility of taking government, um, leading a government by our own thoughts and not just bowing to uh, a king or a despot, and I really like that because it helped to create a world where we could have people like Frederick Douglass, who was the most photographed celebrity of the 19th century and a true thinker. George Washington Carver, who developed over 120 uses for the peanut. And thinkers like that came about directly as a result of the philosophies established during the Enlightenment. So I just something to think about. Anyway, during that period as well, um, cities grew a lot smaller, and we're talking about the fall of Rome as the city of Rome. Cities started shrinking. People became more agrarian. People, going back into the community. But the assumption during the Enlightenment era was that everybody became more ignorant. But like I said, that was not true. People were more well educated during the period of time between the fall of Rome and the Crusades than they were during the Renaissance, which I think is really fascinating. And we do get a lot of really fascinating art. And one thing I want you to look for as we look at this art is think about how human faces are depicted. Think about how human forms are shaped. And think about that in the term of what's important to these people. What are important to the artist? What's important to the audience of these artists? Now, do you remember last week we were looking at the Byzantine figures? They were all really tall with big eyes, kind of very much like the figures in these windows. Very much like these figures.
Yeah.
And this is Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious. This is a little bit later than well, let's see. We actually have a lot of overlap. So this isn't entirely later. This is just centered in Europe itself. Because last week we were looking at a lot of the areas around Transoxiana, which the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. We were looking at Turkey. We were looking at those kinds of areas that the Byzantines and Muslims had control over, or governmental wise. And now we're going into Europe. And even though you can see that there is some of that influence coming into this area, I, I think we can see that there is. I'm going to switch to this so we can see the image a little bit better. I think we can see a little bit different. I mean, to me, these faces read as very individual, very unique, and there seems to be a little bit more of an emotive presence. There seems to be a little bit more expression to them. Like when we saw the Byzantine faces, they all looked kind of angelic almost, or extramortal. They didn't look like they were fully human beings. And I think that these faces look a little bit more individualized and humanistic to me. And look at the hands. The king, Charlemagne. Do you recognize this hand gesture? from last week?
Jesus always does it.
Right. It's with the making the hand where you have the pinky and the ring finger and the thumb closer together and the two other fingers outstretched is a sign of blessing. It's a mudra, that it means blessing. Mudra is a hand symbol. But so he has this as interestingly enough, he's called the Holy Roman Empire Emperor. So he does have the blessing of the church to act in some priestly roles. And so it's completely appropriate for him to be blessing his son, the crown prince. And then you have these other hand gestures. Now, everything isn't completely naturalistic, but I want you to look at the detail. This painting is a small painting. It's only about, I don't think it's much more than 8 or 10 inches high. And part of the reason for a lack of shading and things like that is material. What are they actually using to paint with? If it's a fast drying paint, they're not going to be able to do a lot of shading, typically. But also, we're looking at narrative clarity. They're trying to tell a story and show you who's who. And I think you can really see that in the way that the people are holding their hands, the way that they're looking at each other. All the eyes are pointing at this right here, the hand and Louis's face, all except for these guys over here. And I don't know, this guy is a cardinal. You tell because of his hat and what he's wearing. And I wonder if this setup is everybody here is looking at what's going on here, and maybe he is looking back towards the Pope, and that's what his responsibility is. It'd be interesting to find out for sure, but I think that seems to be kind of makes sense. But I'm just gonna see if we can find. Okay, can you guys see this? It says Dark Ages timeline.
Yeah.
Okay. This gives a little bit of an idea of what's going on between the 5th and 14th centuries. And I want to kind of share this with you. So, and again, we're talking about Europe for the most part. What's going on in Europe? Well, the Western Roman Empire, this is where, Rome as a city in Italy, it falls 476 AD. For the next couple hundred years, people are moving around trying to find places that are stable. They're not threatened by Rome directly anymore, but without a large central government, for a couple hundred years, people are really fighting to see who's going to be in charge. And we already talked about Byzantine and Islamic stuff going on. And the Byzantine Empire thrives for longer than this. I mean, they were the backbone for the Crusades going on from the 11th through the 13th centuries. So and then rise of Islam, they kept going strong right up to the 13th century as well. But when we go back to Europe, what we're talking about is the Carolingian Empire, which is he comes to power after a couple hundred years of people fighting each other for dominance. Not only does Carolingian is another term for under the control of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Chucky the Great or Charles the Great. And he was not only able to consolidate all these kingdoms that were fighting each other right around this time, but he was also able to convince the church that it was in their best interest to work with him and his family. And he created an incredibly stable environment where just a generation before, you really didn't know what you were going to wake up to the next morning. And then overlapping that, and we're going to talk about this next week too, I believe, Vikings, all that kind of stuff, and moving on closer through the Crusades. And that's when we get into the Renaissance. But I hope this I want you guys to explore this a little bit. And I also have some videos here to look at. And I'm going to stop talking about these dark ages as dark ages and start calling them middle ages because they are uh, pretty they should be called the middle ages because they connect that closing of the Roman Empire in the West to the Renaissance. They're in between, so they are the Middle Ages. And there are some really beautiful stuff that they produced that I hope people are shocked by because I think everybody expects artwork of this time to look like this, to be kind of clunky. Can you guys see I'm back at the Scottish stained glass page?
Yes.
Okay. And that's really what people expect, but this is the kind of artwork that is being produced. You know, this is late Middle Ages. And I just I hope people are kind of surprised by this. There's a lot of stylization going on. There's a lot of energy in painting and sculpture and architecture, but it is just not what we expect. You know, when we look back and we hear a term like Dark Ages. Okay, I want you to look at this. Can you guys see this? This is an ivory plaque. Are you able to see this?
Yes.
Okay. The face on this woman is about an inch and a quarter. So this is pretty tiny. From what you have experienced in looking at art and things like this, when do you expect something like this should have been made? From me looking at it without any context, I would say Renaissance. I mean, because this looks really naturalistic. This is amazing to me. The detail for something so tiny is astounding. The fact that this is carved, these look like really photorealistic human beings. You know, and of course the hand is a little bit odd, but that is very obviously a naturalistic hand. Would you guys generally would that be your inclination as well?
I would understand that, especially because of her gown being so intricate. Uh,
Yeah,
but the Roman Empire did some pretty amazing things. It wouldn't be surprising.
you're exactly right. Exactly right. And this is from the beginning of the so-called Dark Ages, the collapse of Rome. And this is from a diptych. A diptych is an art history term which just means two pieces. That's all it means. It's two panels that go together. And I wanted to bring this out because this is the caliber of art from this time period. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful stuff. And once again, this is something that I think is very important to remember. Human beings have always had the capacity to do work like this. And this is, you know, very, very Roman. People have always had the capacity to do this. The reason they choose not to is not because people no longer have an idea how to do it. It has everything to do with what is important to the culture at that time. And so, and we can look at different things in historical context to let us know what is important to artists at the time.
There's still artists today that do scrimshaw and etching and bone and stuff that do really amazing work. So I don't think it's gone away.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And what is important is that those artists choose to do that because that's the style they want to work with. It's not because they don't know any better. And I think that I feel a little bit heated about that because when I was learning about art history back in the 90s, so this is 35 years ago, the message that I was constantly given was the Renaissance was the first time since the fall of Rome that people knew how to do things realistically. And that is not the case. It
So
is the first time since the end of the crusade after the crusades that people chose to follow the path of photorealism. You know that, but that's everything how That's all. That's basically what it is. Now this video, I want to see if we can watch it, but this is important. And the reason it's important, remember last week we were talking about the Byzantine era was where we really start seeing something called the attributes, where saints would hold things or have different colors or look a certain way because there was such a huge market demand for saintly items that regardless of the skill level of the artist involved, the audience needed to be able to identify who it was in the picture, in the image. Do you remember us talking about that?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I brought you to this video here. It's only about 4.5 minutes long. If it works, we'll watch it. If it doesn't, we won't. But this video, you can find the link to this video right here. Ever wonder who's who, how to recognize saints? And this, I thought that this would be important because it talks about what are those attributes? What are those some of those things that are important to remember as an identifier for who the saint is. So I'm going to try to play this. Let me know if you guys hear what's going on and if you see the video. Can you guys hear the piano music?
Yes.
Okay, and can you see this?
Virgin and child, yes.
Yes, okay.
I wanted to talk about how you recognize who's who in late medieval and Renaissance painting. Artists developed conventions to let the audience know who they were looking at.
Legibility was the most important thing, that viewers could look at a work of art and imagine the stories around these divine figures.
Two of the most frequently represented figures are the Virgin Mary, often referred to as the Madonna, and her son, Jesus Christ.
We often see Mary holding on her lap the Christ child. And we also often see Mary seated on a throne. This is the idea that Mary is Queen of Heaven, surrounded by angels. We know that they're angels because they have wings.
But the particular painting that we're looking at is not a single panel. It's a diptych. It's two panels that are hinged. And on the opposite side, we see a scene that is later in time.
We see the crucifixion. This is Christ's death on the cross.
And we see the Virgin Mary a second time as well, this time on the lower left, mourning the death of her son.
And then on the other side, we see the figure of St. John. So it's often Mary and John who we see at the crucifixion.
In addition to the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ, late medieval and early Renaissance paintings often portray saints, and there's a lot of saints. And so it's important that we can distinguish one saint from another.
The easiest way to identify saints is by what they carry, that is, their attribute. So let's look at the saints that we have here.
A great example of an attribute can be seen in the figure on the upper left in light blue. If you look closely, in his right hand he holds two keys. Now these are dark, but originally...
I'm sorry, I just switched the view so it was larger. Can you guys see it bigger now?
Yes.
Okay.
they would probably have been more silvery and they would have been more clear.
Christ says to St. Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. In other words, the keys symbolize Peter's incredible power of opening or shutting the gates of heaven.
And that means that virtually any time you see a figure holding keys, you can identify that figure as St. Peter.
Below Peter, we see St. John the Baptist. St. John the Baptist is often shown in this way, bearded and wearing a cloth of hair.
Also, he's often shown pointing to Christ as he is here. Now, this is just one attribute. There are multiple attributes that artists use to identify figures, and St. John the Baptist is often represented with a lamb as a symbol for Christ.
Those attributes that help us identify John the Baptist tell us something about his role. He points to Christ as someone who came before Christ, but who points the way. And the lamb refers to the phrase that John says, here is the Lamb of God, referring to Christ. With St. John the Baptist, we're looking at a figure who was essentially contemporaneous with Christ's life. But with so many saints, we're looking at figures who lived later, but who, because of persecution gave their lives, often in a very violent and terrible way, for their faith in Christ.
And in this case, St. Catherine is holding two symbols. In her left hand, she holds the wheel, the instrument of torture, but in her right, she holds a palm frond, which is a symbol of her victory over sin and death. Another important female saint is Mary Magdalene.
She's frequently depicted at the feet of Christ, but we often see her standing beside the cross as we do here, and she's always identifiable by her long hair.
Often red. There's another common attribute of Mary Magdalene, which is a jar, which by tradition held ointment that she used to anoint.
I really like this because these are two Marys, but by knowing the attributes, you know exactly this is Mary the Mother or Madonna, and this is Mary Magdalene.
Christ's feet. Another important figure, one of the four doctors or fathers of the church, is Saint Jerome, and he's often clothed in bright red.
And he's often accompanied by a lion, and this comes from a fable that St. Jerome pulled a thorn from a lion's paw, and the lion befriended him.
And here we see two female saints who are holding their attributes in a chalice and on a plate.
In this case, carrying the particular ways in which they suffered for their faith. So we see St. Lucy, whose eyes were gouged out, and on the right, St. Agatha, whose breasts were sheared off.
Although, according to tradition, she was miraculously healed.
And you'll notice both carry those same palm fronds that saints often carry.
And these are only a few of the many attributes that artists used to help viewers identify which saint is which.
So I think that is a really good background on the attributes to help you identify figures in some of these things. And I wanted to, I wanted to look at just a couple things before we look at some of the art. But all of these are really fun links. I would say go through as many of these as you can. Some of these are really astounding. Oops. Okay. I'm going to share one with you. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
This is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. What is interesting about this, by being aware of things like those attributes, what kinds of stories do you think are being told right through here? I would think, guess we know, can you tell what this image is right here?
Adam and Eve.
It kind of looks like Adam and Eve. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, both of you got it
Yeah.
right away. And a lot of that is because of the attributes. Adam and Eve their attributes are usually they have a fig leaf covering them or they're covering themselves like that. They're almost always by a tree and they have a serpent right there. And that connects you to an understanding that all these are Bible and saint stories. All of them are going to be that. And then with that frame of reference, we can look at these other things and start getting an idea of who these characters are. We know we have enough clues to be looking for biblically related or saint related stories and looking for those attributes. And that helps us to identify what's going on to the point where we have a much better understanding of what these stories could be and what they are. And I just think that kind of thing is pretty amazing. I'm sorry, I'm sharing. I had to stop sharing because it went a little bit crazy. There we go. All right, can you guys see my screen again?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And I want to show you some, I mentioned literacy. One of the things that happened during this time period is that we mentioned that from the fall of Rome for the next couple hundred years, there were a lot of people were producing art, but governments were vying with each other to see who could come out on top. And at the end of that period was a guy named Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who really was able to help people understand they'd make a lot more money, be a lot healthier, be a lot happier if they got along with each other under one government, which was, fortunately enough for him, his government. During that time, he made people safe. And because he made people safe, people were able to produce beautiful things. Some of them were books. And so we're not going to watch this whole video, but I did want to show you some of the stuff. This is from Lindisfarne Gospels. And now we are looking, we're going back in time. It looks a little bit to me visually, this is very Byzantine. And this reminds me an awful lot of those Byzantine mosaics, that kind of level of shading, which is to say not very much at all. But even this is a lot simpler than that. But a couple of the things that are important to look at is, first off, this page is maybe 10 inches tall. So we're talking about very small work. We're also talking about quick drying paint. So they're not going to be able to do a lot of shading. And we're talking about, for an audience, you do have a lot of literacy compared to later Renaissance, but we're looking for an audience that wants to connect very quickly with the imagery that's being shown. So in this case, you are going to have the artists are going to be really leaning heavily towards attributes. That's why we see the halos. My guess is that this is probably going to be, this is going to definitely be one of the evangelists. But the reason why the Lindisfarne Gospels are so important is because they show the book arts with attributes and the kinds of things that people were able to do at this time. And keep in mind, these pages are about the size of your notebook, so they're not very big. Look at what's going on. None of this is laid out. This is all painted directly on. None of this is designed with the aid of computers or anything. It's all hand-drawn, and it's all hand-drawn with teeny tiny brushes and relatively fast-drying paint. So these books are pretty astounding. And what is really interesting too is these guys are defining how other people will do similar layouts later on too. During this time, this is when Charlemagne decides, you know what, I think it's going to be a really good idea for people to have an identifiable lettering system. So this is where two different fonts are developed that everybody who makes books uses. This is at a time, this is still 700 years before the printing press, and everything has to be handwritten. But Charlemagne is one that starts pushing for the idea that if we make all the letters that everybody's using look the same, then it's going to be pretty standardized so that anybody is going to be able to read it without having to be trained in how to read that particular handwriting. And I think that's pretty amazing too. And you can see some of that handwriting in this. And these letters, you can see these letters have a certain consistency to them. A little bit more of a close-up. And that's one of the reasons why the Lindisfarne Gospels are so important, is because they did kind of establish what the font is going to look like, how people are going to write and communicate, and also the layouts for future paintings of the same kind of situations. And I include medieval calendar and some other things here so that everybody can, I don't know, I'm thinking there might be some interesting ideas for projects if you guys are interested. But I want to share, this is from an even older book. This is during that time period where people were still running around and, you know, vying for who is more in control. And what's interesting is that in this, you can see that the lettering is a lot less consistent. We do have some repeated shapes that we see, but it's not as clear as that other one that was done under Charlemagne's direction. And this is not nearly as well taken care of. Of course, it is 150 years older, and this barely survived a fire. But for the it doesn't feel to me like this is quite as developed as that other one. And again, it's not because people are dumb, but it's because I think that they probably didn't feel as sheltered and supported as the bookmakers did under Charlemagne. And here we do start seeing this idea of maybe a potential need for a consistent text. But even here, you see, here's a theta and a theta, and you can see they're very different. And here's another one. So these three are very different. And we saw in that other one that we looked at first that the lettering was a lot more consistent. Anyway, I just think that stuff like that is really fascinating. Now, I'm hoping that you guys will enjoy this. I want to talk about Charlemagne a little bit, but I'm hoping that you guys kind of enjoy this. This is just a little video that, and we're not going to listen to very much of it, just a little bit. Can you guys see this? It says Old French.
Yes.
Okay, this is what people kind of sounded like at this time.
Old French language, français, la chanson de Roland.
Belle fut l'ivesse, près les soleils fut clé. Les dissimulés fait Charles Establé. El grand verger fait les reis tendre un trèfle. Les 10 messages ad fétin s'ostelé.
So this gives a little bit of, this is what the person was saying right here. And then this is what the English translation of it is. So that's how the language kind of sounded at the time. I just thought, you know, I thought that might be interesting to everybody.
It kind of sounds like Dutch.
It does not sound like the French that we're used to, does it?
No.
And I agree with you. It does sound very, to me, it sounds very much like, it sounds a lot more like Dutch than it does French. And I'm really impressed that you picked that out too. But it's fascinating to me. Sometimes I like just looking up, you know, what you remember, like right at the beginning of the semester, I played a little bit of what ancient Mesopotamian might have sounded like, or Akkadian, that language. And nobody knows for sure, but there's a good chance it sounded like something like that. But I like that awareness of the alienness of language. And so whenever you watch a time travel movie from now on, and you know that going back to these times and suddenly everybody can hear each other, probably a good chance they did not speak like Henry Cavill did when he uses his English accent, you know. And then this video too is kind of a fun one to look at. This is some more sounds, but I'm not going to really play it right now. You guys can watch it when you want to.
In Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, they all spoke English. Socrates.
Yeah, everybody spoke English, and I love, yeah, when they bring the girlfriends back up to the modern time and they discover the magic of the credit card. I think, yeah, it's awesome movie. But I did want you guys, this is something that I think is kind of fun that I did want to share with you, because it kind of gives you an idea of what music may have sounded like at this time. This is a woman, her stage name is Hildegard von Blingen, and she is actually a musicologist that studied music, that studies music from the time of King Charlemagne. And I just thought you guys, we're not going to listen to the whole thing. We're just going to listen to a little bit, but I thought you'd think it would be interesting.
I fell upon my sword to see if I could die. I woke upon the moon, and still I was alive. The arrow tears.
Do you guys recognize the original tune?
Yes.
Yeah, I just thought that this was really kind of a fun thing because at this time, we're so comfortable with orchestration and bands and things like that. Usually people would have an instrument of some sort that they could play with their hands, and like a stringed instrument, like in this case, uh, some sort of similarity to a harp, for example, and it would be usually a single line melody, and that's pretty much how a lot of music in Europe they think was, and I just thought that would be kind of a fun thing for people to look at. So going back to the history a bit at this time, the after the close of Rome, and we're talking about Rome, Italy, political power shifted back to the hands of regional leaders. They were vying with each other for power. It wasn't always fighting. I mean, it would be simple if it was just people trying to stab each other, but people would vie for power everywhere from marriage politics, where if you had a lot of children, you could marry into different families and gain power that way. During trade politics, where if you controlled trade routes and things like that, you could make it easy for people that you liked to trade and more difficult for people that you didn't. You could provide goods to people that wouldn't ever see them any other way other than if you helped them out, that kind of a thing. And then you also did have uh, physical violence, you know, uh, threats of war and warfare. And it's not always people stabbing each other. Sometimes it's people suggesting that if you travel in certain areas, you wouldn't be safe unless you hired their bodyguards because their bodyguards would know the way. And if people didn't, of course, hired your bodyguards, then oddly enough, the highwaymen would find them and steal from it. Different things like that. It wasn't always overt, in your face warfare like you see in movies. And very interesting. And sometimes it would be religious or spiritual warfare too. Whose ancestral gods or whose family connection to God is strongest. And in this, about 100 years later, there was a group of people called the Merovingians, and these are this predates Matrix by quite a while, but the Merovingians are a royal family that lived in France that clung very strongly to this story that pregnant Mary Magdalene came with Joseph of Arimathea and landed on the southern coast of France. And it was her bloodline, hinted at that it was the bloodline of Christ himself, that became the Merovingian king bloodline. And that's how they consolidated their political power. And then towards the end of their reign, that's when Charlemagne came onto the scene. And Charlemagne was incredibly brilliant. Just, and he consolidated, he was able to win by making friends more than he was by terrifying people. But the people that didn't understand what he was doing were terrified, and rightly so, because they knew that he was consolidating power. So definitely watch both of these. And then I want to show you something that marked Carolingian architecture. And remember I said that Charlemagne, Carolinus, Carolingian, and Charlemagne all referred to the same person, and his name was Charles the Great. The Francophile version of his name is Charlemagne, and Carolingian is just another version of the same thing. So it's all the same person. But I want you to look at the architecture this time and see if you recognize anything from other stuff that we've looked at. Okay, can you see this? This is a map that I'm showing right now. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is France right through here. This is Italy right in here. We have Turkey over here. This is where Byzantium is. Rome, the Roman Empire fell, but Charlemagne, he probably came from this area here, but he really consolidated power by taking over the Merovingian holdings. So people started associating him with the Merovingian line, which meant that a lot of people believe that he may have had it was hinted very strongly that he may have had the blood of Christ in him as well. But this is the area that he took over. And he made friends with the Italian church or the Catholic Church, and they made friends with him and made him the Holy Roman Emperor, which meant that he had a mandate of heaven and he could partake in some of the priestly duties. So very strong connection to the church. But he wanted people to make sure that the church was not the political juggernaut, that you still had a separation of the king and the church. So which is very important. Separation of church and state. That idea was very strong. Had a strong connection with the church, but he was still a king and not a pope. And that's important to remember. So if we go down, we can start seeing the architecture. Now, to me, this is Carolingian architecture, but this looks to me very much like that Byzantine stuff we looked at earlier. And I want you to look at some of these images. Do you recognize this kind of style of mosaic work?
Yes,
It looks very Byzantine, doesn't it?
it does. Very
But
rich in color and pattern.
Yeah, but this is Carolingian. Now, with Carolingian, you still have those very strong Roman arches. You have that Byzantine style mosaic. But one of the things you'll notice is that these bodies are not quite as tall. There's more humanistic features in the face, and there's less color separation in the robes. It's not shaded as well as the typical Byzantine stuff was. And I think, and some of the other things that we'll look at it. You can see some of the buildings later. This is talking about very strong influence from the Byzantine, from the Roman, from the Greek empires. But now we start seeing this is the real Carolingian architecture. Now it looks Byzantine. You have that central kind of dome idea. But what do you see the big difference with the roof line?
We kind of have multiple points here. It looks like kind of like a flower, like an overtipped flower.
Oh, what you're talking about with the arch? Yeah, with that kind of dome. Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. What I want you to look at for just a second is this part right here that my arrow's pointing on. Remember the angle of degrees of the slope on the Byzantine roofs. What was that? Do you guys remember?
22 something.
22.5 degrees. Yeah, because it's a holdover. They're direct inspiration from the Roman. This is a 60-degree slope. Do you see that? Very different. And I'll give you a reason, one of the possible reasons, and I think it is the most probable. The 3-point equilateral triangle is a really old Christian symbol. It goes back to the 2nd century of Christianity, and it represents it's a triangle of 3 equal angles that represents the Trinity or the Godhead, or the God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. And this is a feature you will see that separates out Carolingian architecture from Byzantine architecture, because Charlemagne really stressed the idea of the Trinity to remind people of his connection with the Catholic Church in Europe. Isn't that interesting? Everything else looks very similar, doesn't it? Other than what Lindsay pointed out with that lobed dome. Because I see the Roman arch, I see the Roman arch, I see the Roman arch, but instead of the Roman roof, I see the 60-degree angle. Isn't that interesting?
It's interesting how something so seemingly unimportant was actually like designed with such intention as to represent the Holy Trinity.
Yeah, it's dramatic. And what's interesting to look at this. This is another Carolingian church or Carolingian structure. You see the Roman arches again in the windows, and the biggest difference is that roof. Now we're going up to 60 degree. We're approaching 60 degrees again. And it's not always going to be exactly 60 degrees, but it's going to be that in a lot of really important places, like over the apse. This is the apse. This is the area where the very front of the church, usually these are facing east, and inside the church, if you can imagine, that the priest would be about right here. And so that if it happened in the morning, the sun would come in through these windows and illuminate the priest from the back. And we can talk about cathedral architecture later, but I think it's that kind of idea is really important to remember, that we're changing roof lines. And I'm going to go back to here. Let's see. We're not going to look at all these videos, the whole thing, but I do want to find imagery in the videos. And I'm hoping that you'll see some of the same things that I see in this. So this is Charlemagne's chapel at Aachen. And this is where Lindsay was pointing out all the interesting elements of the mosaic and stuff like that we had talked about. You can see the Roman arch. It's interesting to me, it has stripes like you also see in some of the Muslim architecture. So they are using an awful lot from the Byzantine inspired stuff. But what does this remind you of? This area through here in the mosaic. This reminds me an awful lot of things like the Dome of the Rock, or the mosque at Damascus. That level of intricate detail. And I don't know. So they are borrowing an awful lot from Byzantine work. And I think that's just really amazing. This, when we look at this this is a relief. This is done during this time. This is at the tail end of Charlemagne's influence. This is right before the Crusades start. But do you remember that image in the Lindisfarne Gospels that we looked at earlier? This panel.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
It's amazing to me. This reminds me of that so much. Same kind of way of addressing the human figure, where you're more interested in the storytelling than you are realism. But we still have this, the halo. He's called St. Matthew. St. Matthew is a lot of the times going to be writing in a book, because he's the guy that was considered the record keeper. He was the tax collector. And he told a lot of stories. So a lot of the times he's going to be being shown doing that. But it's interesting to me that he seems to be this seems to be taken right out of that Lindisfarne Gospels image. And I do not think that that's a coincidence at all. And here we have a different saint, and he's in the same kind of posture writing. Most of the time when you see a saint writing like this, it's going to be one of the four gospel saints, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you can usually tell who they are because of the animal. If there's an animal associated with it, there'll be an animal attribute. And this seems to me to be something that was put in later. So this represents the far reaching of Charlemagne's might, right? When we talked about the standard of where the king was powerful enough that he was able to command trade, so that the standard of brought in lapis from Afghanistan and coral from the Arabian Sea, kind of demonstrating how much control he had or how much influence he had. And here, these are ivory panels that were made a couple hundred years before this that are incorporated into the structure of the church itself, because they're ivory panels that were made in the 6th century and probably brought from northern Egypt, is what they're thinking. But they're incorporated in to kind of demonstrate the power of Charlemagne, that, you know, he's able to make people feel secure, healthy, and happy, and trade in areas all around the world. And it kind of demonstrates the strength of his leadership. Now here we see, this looks very Byzantine to me. And some of the only things that are clues that this is not Byzantine is that these roof slopes they're not all 60 degrees, not at all. A lot, like this one is at 22.5 degrees, but they're starting to stretch beyond that 22.5 degrees. I think that is one big hint that this is reaching towards Carolingian architecture or Charlemagne influence. And the way that this is constructed, making it look more like their protective walls, things like that, taking place in Europe, having this kind of rounded structure here continuing out instead of making it blocky with those smaller buildings, that I think kind of hints at this being Carolingian as opposed to Byzantine. But it looks very heavily influenced by Byzantine work. You know, especially like this little outbuilding supporting, or this smaller structure supporting the larger structure here, and these smaller structures supporting the larger structures. It feels to me like this is very heavily influenced by Byzantine work. Did we also talk about sacred geometry and stuff like that? I don't know if we did. If we haven't yet, we'll probably talk about it more later. But it's interesting to me that this feels like it may have been influenced a little bit by the same kind of thinking behind the Dome of the Rock. I don't think it was influenced directly by that, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of that inspiration came into it. But can you see that you have the octagon there? And do you remember we talked about the octagon as being a symbol for something?
Yes, but don't ask me what it was a symbol for. I just remember it was a supporting factor to like the heavens, which was the dome.
Yeah. It's a symbol of the bridge between earth and heaven. So for Christians, generally, it's going to be associated with Christ. And for Muslims, it's generally going to be associated with the Quran. Okay, we only have 15 minutes left. I would really like you guys to go through and watch some of these videos about like the book arts, and definitely the sculpture, looking at some of the sculpture. The reason I want to bring up the book arts is Charlemagne. One of the things that Hitler's people tried really hard to do was to find the burial site of Charlemagne and to get his bones for themselves, because it would symbolize ultimate control over Europe. Charlemagne was so important because he is recognized as the figure that connected and solidified Europe as an identity. Let's see, I'm trying to find that map again. Oh, I'm not finding the map of Europe, but Charlemagne really brought Europe together as a single identity from Portugal all the way to the east. You know, all the countries that we now identify as Europe in the European Union were pretty much brought together because of Charlemagne. And that's just like Emperor Qin did for China, Charlemagne did for Europe. And part of his legacy was making people feel safe. And that's why under his leadership, literacy quadrupled. And under his leadership, that's why the book arts flourished. As we think about it, it takes a lot of energy to build a book. And when you're building a book, you can't be farming for yourself. You can't be cooking your own food. You know, I mean, on a big scale, you can't be making your own clothes. You have to be in a safe space, sheltered from everybody else, with the time that it takes and the resources to create everything from the binding and the glue and the skins that you're using, the vellum that you're using to generate ink, create paints, to do all of that in order to build a book. And that kind of thing is astounding to me. And I think that more than anything else really shows the legacy of Charlemagne, because their art was not just valued, but folks felt safe. And they felt safe enough to actually make a book. And these books would take years to create because of all the painting and everything else. You know, looking at this looks very much to me like Etruscan painting. It doesn't look like a lot of energy is given to realism. The only way that you know that this is the Madonna and Jesus is because that is standard imagery. You know, somebody holding a baby on their lap is going to be a Madonna and child. And then you see the halo. It's interesting to me that the grumpy baby doesn't have a halo. So I wonder what this. But this is something that, even though this was created in a different part of Europe, it's created in large part because of the legacy of Charlemagne. He really valued literacy. And it just, I don't know, I think there's some pretty amazing stuff going on. Anyway, so take the time to go through that. Look at the book arts, watch as many of those videos as you can, and find something really interesting. I think you could do some really fascinating projects about this, just from the Carolingian arts. Anyway, I wanted to also ask people, hopefully you can see this. This is the discussion for the third project. I hope everybody who does their projects remembers to put them on the discussion board so everybody can check it out. But definitely check out the projects. The stuff that people have been doing is amazing. It's really been very amazing. So, and Lindsay, I don't know, I don't think this link worked. When I tried to access it too, the sound wasn't working on it.
Yeah, I saw that. And see, when I listen to it on my computer, it seems fine. I don't know what I need to do to make it like actually visible to people.
Okay. All right. Because I set a link up for the YouTube video, and I don't know if you're able to copy that link that I sent you and you want to
Yeah.
just post it, then people could actually see it. But yeah, that
Okay.
was really interesting. But I love what people have done. Like here, somebody's designing a Pokemon inspired. Amelia designed a Pokemon inspired by different ancient art styles, which I think is just really amazing, and just some absolutely incredible stuff. So, and this one I think is really fascinating, and Zach's are pretty amazing. So, look at these, check them out, and don't forget when you submit your own project, make sure that you get it posted on this discussion so everybody else can see what people are doing too. Because I think it really helps uh, folks to see what people are working on and what they're doing project wise, because it gives you really good ideas too. So it's just some really very cool stuff. And remember, for all the research projects, you only get points when it's tied specifically to the subject matter of the class, which is art from prehistorical times up to the year 1350. So do you guys have any observations or comments about the stuff that we looked at?
It's interesting to see just in general through the course of this class how art has kind of evolved onto itself. And so like you're pointing out the Byzantine Empire in today's topic, but then we go back to the Byzantine Empire and then it looks like Mesopotamian work and then how all those cultures affect each other and their artwork is cool to see.
I really, that's a really excellent that's a really excellent observation, because it is, you can kind of tell who is talking to who
Mm-hmm.
by what kind of symbols, what kind of affectations show up in their art and architecture. Now, I just noticed that some of the links that I put in this for like Carolingian architecture and stuff like that are not working. So I'm going to replace that, and I'm going to find some new sites to look at, and so that you guys get a better idea, because I think it'll really help to see what they're doing, like some of the things that we talked about, if we can see more examples of the actual architecture. And I'm having a hard time, but I will do, as soon as we get off this call, I will do that. No, I think, Lindsay, I think that's a really valuable observation, especially if somebody like Charlemagne is going to show off his ability to connect people with putting in those, going to decorating his chapel with ivory plaques that he found in Egypt, or he got from Egypt. I think that that's really, or the king of Ur. Excuse me. I want to show some, my brain's going all over the place. I want to show a couple other examples of Carolingian architecture. And can you guys see this page?
Yeah.
Okay. I think these are really good examples, because you start seeing, here's that 60-degree slope on the roof. Here's that 60-degree slope of the roof. 60-degree slope on the roof. You can see that with more images than just Aachen Chapel. And there are some really good churches where you can see the two towers that he liked using. Under Carolingian influence, there were a lot of the times chapels like this chapel. Hope you can see this. He would put two towers on either side of a church. Two. This is where we start seeing things like Notre Dame is heavily inspired by Carolingian architecture. Can you guess why he would put two of these towers on either side of the access point?
Could it resemble unity?
Yeah, that's really good, because one of these represents the church, one of these represents the state. Remember, Carolinus or Charlemagne was really big about making sure people understood he was not the Pope, but he was the champion of the church. And so under Carolingian architecture, a lot of times you'll see two towers like this at the entrance to a church, because to remind you that there is the Pope and then there is the Holy Roman Emperor. And I
So
think,
is he saying I'm not the Pope, I'm better than that?
no. What he's saying is the Pope is there to lead people's souls. I am here to protect people's souls.
Okay.
Does that make more sense?
Yes.
Because he is the political arm and the Pope that represents the spiritual arm. So the church is spirit, the emperor is political. And I think that that's really important too, because the church had a habit of really getting its hands into politics. And I think that Charlemagne was trying really hard to kind of separate that out a bit so that he would be in charge of taxes and then they could receive their tithes. And it would be a totally separate kind of thing. But yeah, I think we see some really nice images that show late Carolingian architecture. And here you can really see the two tower kind of thing going on. Really good. And you can see that the roofs are getting closer to that 60 degrees, like right here. All right, and here's a lodge where you have that part timber construction, and that's you start seeing that roof line. And we're also talking about as we get in more northern Europe, people are going to be dealing with snowfall quite a bit more, and so it kind of makes sense to have a little bit sharper slope on the roof too. But it is totally understandable. And this is really another good example of the Carolingian type church where you have the two towers again to remind you of church and state. I think that's really interesting. So not really separating them, but reminding you have an emperor and you also have the Pope. So I'll find some more of that kind of stuff to share with people. So yeah, that was a really good observation, Lindsay. Zach, any observation or questions that you have about stuff that we looked at?
No questions. I did have an idea to incorporate this new painting I'm doing for this week's thing based on Christian iconography. So
Oh, for the project, for the fourth project?
yes.
I think
So last week and then this one got me motivated to do a painting with some of this iconography in it.
I think that's great. As long as you tie it squarely into iconography from this time period, I think that'll work beautifully. And you've been doing pretty good in making sure that everybody understands that connection. So I think that sounds great.
Well, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for being with me today, guys. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend, and I look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday.
See you then.
Toodles.
Toodles.